Today, we are joined by Rehs-Dupin of TQAMP. Chris is a brilliant mind and heart in our industry with a focus on breaking down barriers for queer and trans young people who want to feel the joy of summer camp. We'll be chatting today about the importance of and how best to run scenarios during staff training. Remember what sparked your passion for camp? UltraCamp knows it's about the people, not the paperwork. That's why they built a platform to simplify your camp management. Learn more at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode. Camp leaders, win back your time to what matters most, your campers. Bolin's comprehensive accounting, back office solutions, and tech-enabled team free up your staff to focus on your mission. Visit bolinhq.com, that's BOWLINEHQ.com, to learn more and book a free 2-hour financial diagnostic. Welcome to Camp Code, a podcast brought to you by Go Camp Pro. For us in the world of summer camp, there is nothing more important than well-researched, well-planned, well-thought-out, and well-prepared leadership training. It's at the crux of all we do. It's how we deliver a safe, exciting, kind, supportive, growth-filled experience for our campers and their families. It's how we have our staff return year after year. It's how we make the biggest impact on the world around us. So join us today as we delve into the world of staff training, the good, the hard, and everything in between, because we're in it together. So we welcome a very special guest today. We're so excited to once again be graced with a visit from Chris of TQAMP, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we dive in, let's just take a moment to introduce ourselves. So Gab, could you go first, please?
Yes. Hey, everybody. My name is Gabrielle Rail, and I'm one of the camp directors of Camp Waro. Camp Waro is an all-girls camp with a bilingual program, and we create a positive environment for girls and non-binary and gender minority campers and staff members. And my pronouns are she, her, elle.
Thank you for the bilingualism.
Thank you very much.
And Chris, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Absolutely. My name is Chris Rehs-Dupin. I use the pronouns he, him, and I am one of the co-founders and co-executive directors at TQAMP. And our mission is to support camps and youth-focused organizations to become spaces of belonging for people of all genders and sexualities by making them safer for us LGBTQIA plus campers and staff.
Excellent. And we're so glad you're here, if we haven't said that already, like 3 times. I'm Beth Allison. I'm a former camp director and executive director, and now a camp consultant. And I'm co-owner of Camp Packer and Go Camp Pro. And my pronouns are she, her, and as always, I have a true passion for intentional leadership training. All right. So welcome back, Chris. We are so thrilled that you're here, and you have such incredible insight and wisdom into making people feel included and accepted, as well as having a superb camp director brain. So we're very grateful to have you here with us today to chat about scenarios at leadership training. So here's my first question to the 3 of us. Why bother with scenarios at all? Like, what's the point? Can't we just explain to them rules, protocols, policy, and advice for dealing with campers and parents and each other? Well, of course, we know the answer to that. But what exactly is the benefit of running scenarios during training? So, Chris, why don't we start off with you?
Yeah, so I feel like with the work that I do with TCAMP, I'm pretty uniquely positioned because I travel to camps across the country and get to share a lot of the same information with a lot of different people. And one thing that we noticed last summer was we were spending a lot of time going over terms and concepts and giving tools. And then we would come to the scenario portion, which we thought folks would be ready for. And even though we had done a whole bunch of teaching, people weren't ready to respond to those scenarios. Even
Interesting.
though we felt like there was a high comprehension rate for the tools that we were going over, people were able to use them. But then when faced with a scenario, it's like all of that just went away. So we really thought about how can we introduce the problem solving piece earlier and then teach tools as we go. And I think really this is kind of this component of helping frontline or direct service staff understand that they don't have to memorize everything, that that scenarios actually help them know where to access the solution to the problem instead of, again, knowing exactly what to do. So working out that problem solving muscle actually helps them become like aligned in the way they respond to a scenario instead of saying, if this happens, then you do this. So just really giving folks the tools to develop their own critical thinking skills that also align with the way the camp wants to respond to any given scenario.
Right, because today answers are everywhere. Like critical thinking skills are not really necessary. Like it's all here on my phone. You know what I
Yep.
mean? So yes,
Yeah.
giving them the opportunity to flex those muscles and make them stronger is really important. Gab,
Yeah.
what about you?
As we know, I'm for not wasting your time, not wasting staff members' time. And as most of us know, experiential learning really heightens not only information understanding, but information retention. And like a good camp counselor, I have all of my lifeguarding, including my beach NLS. Thank you very much. It's a big deal. And I'll tell you that in lifeguarding, in first aid scenarios, the doing scenarios is key to being a good lifeguard. And we repeat these scenarios over and over again so that they're part of our muscle memories, they're part of our experiences. But it gets into our emotional psyche as well. So it can mimic how maybe awkward some conversations are and how awkward we feel. And that can help with some of the processing too. Sometimes when things are awkward or stressful, we forget next steps. So actually doing it in a scenario based way will really, really heighten the learning. And I think because a lot of us grew up in our typical school system where a lot is lecture based, sometimes when we're teaching at camp, we sort of fall into that same model of what we've seen at schools. And some schools, what they're doing is they're adapting homework to be done at home, at school, and no longer at home for that purpose, so that it's an experiential activity with a teacher beside you that's helping you guide that process. And a lot of times students that go home and do their homework on their own do really, really, really poorly. But that's because they haven't learned the lesson yet. The scenario-based learning, the experiential-based learning is really important. And it can be fun. And it can also show you how staff members are going to react in certain situations. So maybe some staff members that don't seem like a bright, shiny star during staff training, you might see them in scenario-based stuff and say, "Oh, wow, they can really think on their feet." They're actually quite funny too. Whereas other staff members, you might see some of those little cracks in the system where they do get overwhelmed or anxious. So I think it also tells you a lot of information. And personally, that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at their learning, looking at how they're managing their stress. I'm also paying attention to the other side of how's the staff member actually doing in these different scenarios that we're creating for them.
Thanks, Gab. And I think that in this era, our staff members are so used to visual learning. Like they watch videos all day. They see people in action or listen to them share their experiences on TikTok. So if we can make the learning more hands-on by having them witness skits or sit together in partners or small groups and walk themselves through a scenario and how it would go. And it goes a long way in helping our brains process the information that we're hearing from other staff members, from yourself, and it helps them to think through how they would handle that situation. I also think that it can allow them to talk about experiences that may have happened in the past that they never thought of before. And it may have never occurred to them, for example, that a cabin full of boys would fill balloons with their own urine and then throw them at a cabin of girls at sunrise, for example. Not that ever happened, or that it ever happened during outdoor ed in the spring and was not only encouraged, but instigated by one of the parent volunteers. But anyway, I
I mean,
digress.
a
So
classic
Classic
camp example.
oh boy. So
I would love to have seen your face because you have you can hide but then when you were disappointed or frustrated or are you bleeping kidding me faced is one of my favorite Beth Allison faces.
my face has subtitles,
Yeah, well, it
if there's
does.
nothing coming out. But anyway, so
But I
it's
think this is like a really sorry, I feel like this
yeah,
is
yeah.
like that's such a good example because
Mhm.
you're not gonna have a written urine and balloon
No.
protocol.
No.
You don't have that. So the
Well, we do
scenario
now, but
we
Yes.
do know, great, put it in a policy or a practice is void,
yeah.
right? we need to
Yeah.
know, okay, what is our baseline for responding to the urine and the balloon scenario,
Yeah.
right? And we can align around that through scenario work. Thanks for bringing
Absolutely.
that to light.
So it gives staff insight into behaviors and emergencies, into campers that learn differently than they do, and so on. And it allows time to discuss and debate and give answers that might not be the best strategy when it doesn't count, so that they can learn from more experienced staff before campers arrive. And I also strongly believe that scenarios are a great way to put into practice the information that you've just had a session on, or better yet, that you had a session on yesterday and now you give them scenarios and they've had that time to process some of that information. And of course, I am always a proponent of staff having their say. So getting them involved in answering and asking questions and commenting on scenarios and giving their insight and their wisdom, they're going to be much more invested if their opinions are asked for. So we're going to take a quick break to hear from our sponsor, and then we're going to dive into the meat and tofu of all this stuff. Camp leaders, do you often find yourself bogged down with bookkeeping, accounting, and other back office tasks, taking precious time away from what matters most, your campers? Imagine a solution that frees up your staff to focus on creating impactful and memorable experiences for your campers. That's where Bolin comes in. Bolin offers comprehensive accounting back office solutions designed specifically for camps. Our tech-enabled team handles everything from payroll and bookkeeping to financial reporting, compliance, expense management, spend control, and more, allowing your staff to passionately pursue your number one purpose. With Bolin, you can streamline your camp's financial operations, reduce stress, and ensure your team is free to make a lasting impact in campers' lives. It's time to win back your time and work with a financial partner that truly understands camps. Whether you're a for-profit, not-for-profit, overnight, or day camp, Bolin has a solution for you. Visit bolinhq.com, that's BOWLINEHQ.com, to learn more and book a free 2-hour financial diagnostic. The report is yours whether you sign up or not. Let Bolin take care of your accounting needs so you can focus on what truly matters, your campers. A special offer from UltraCamp for Camp Code listeners. Get ready for next season's staff recruiting with the Camp Experience Wheel, a powerful tool to prevent burnout, boost retention, and make sure your staff feels supported. Download it for free at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode. Tired of juggling multiple systems? UltraCamp offers a platform that simplifies your work by combining all aspects of camp management into one seamless solution. UltraCamp brings everything you need into one easy-to-use platform. Plan schedules and activities with just a few clicks. Easily organize, schedule, and automate your communications. Register and track campers easily. Manage payments and donations seamlessly. Get back to what you love. UltraCamp helps you spend less time on admin tasks and more time creating unforgettable camp experiences. Ready to see if UltraCamp is the perfect fit? Schedule your free, personalized demo at ultracampmanagement.com/campcode. Okay, so we're back. Gab, did you like my little head nod to the vegetarians and the vegans?
I did. And I saw Chris's he had a little smile smirk going on when you said it too. So
So, what kinds of scenarios do you run with your staff? And do you say scenarios or scenarios? I don't know. All right, Chris.
How fancy I'm feeling.
Just realized it
Yeah.
came out of my mouth differently than the first time I said it. But anyway, what kind of scenarios do you run with your staff, Chris?
Well, I think when we run scenarios, like we want to ensure that everybody has a scenario that they can actually solve for, right? So
Love that.
thinking about how do you ensure that everybody has one they can be successful with? Because nobody wants a 90-point scenario when they haven't even learned where the dining hall is. So I think one of the most important things is really understanding what folks are walking in with and starting at that kind of very simple scenario level of, I mean, I give this example because I went through an entire staff training and this was my third year at camp. It was my third year in camping, first year at a new camp. And I had someone come to me, a camper, and say, where do I go to the bathroom? And I had, after 10 days of training, I did not know the answer to whether this person could take a buddy and go to the bathroom or not. So starting with those like really, really basic ones of a camper comes up to you, this is where you are, and they ask to take a buddy to the bathroom. What do you do? Right. So we can start at that very simple level and then build to those more nuanced, multi-layered responses that we see if there's an emergency or a bullying situation.
Mhm.
So I think that's a couple of things to consider as far as what to run. Another space to look at is where in the last couple of years have you seen your staff not align and how to respond to a scenario? So running that type of scenario and then getting folks to the response that you actually want them to give. Or maybe you actually don't know how you want them to respond when a kid shows
Mm.
up at tie dye without their white t shirt. But we can talk about the multiple different options and then problem solve as a whole group. So when you get that kid at tie dye without a white t shirt, everybody has an idea of this is actually how we should solve this together. And then I think one of the hardest ones to talk about, but also really important, is to really have a worst case
Mm.
scenario, right? Like truly, what is think of something really, really hard that is plausible at camp, not super likely, but getting folks to understand from beginning of the scenario all the way through the full emergency protocol actually takes some of the heat out of it when it happens in real life, right? We just went through the hardest scenario we can possibly come up with. And at each turn, we had ways to support that learning. So when folks, if they do experience that crisis at camp,
Mhm.
they can at least kind of nod back to that moment and say, okay, these were some things that were successful when we talked about a worst case scenario. We can deploy these now. So I think those are a couple of things that we consider when we walk through scenarios with camps to again help them work out that muscle, help them work out the conversational piece of it, and again just gather them into alignment surrounding different responses.
Great. Thank you. Gab, what about you? What
Uh,
scenarios do you run at Woro?
I use my return shockingly, I use my returning staff to come up with scenarios. My favorite thing to do is say something along the lines, okay, finish the sentence. I wished that first year staff members knew how to blank during meal times. I wished that first year staff members during programming were able to X. And so we sort of come up with a bunch of things. If we're in the mission of rehiring staff members, that we are interviewing them, and so your returning staff members are there to lift other people up. They're also the people that work with first year staff members and can see where maybe some of the cracks in the knowledge might be missing. And we do this activity not in putting down people that are first year
Mm.
employees. Some
Right.
of the obviously not. Some of those staff members were first years the year before. They're returning as a second year. So I wish I knew how to X. I wish I knew how to. And when we do that first part of the activity, typically what we're creating is a list of skills that I probably have already taught, truthfully. It's a little bit of an ego check for myself. I'm humbled by some of the things that I see that my staff aren't prepared or they don't know, such as do you know if a person can go to the washroom by themselves or do they need a buddy? Sometimes I'm shocked that they don't know this information, but it's very, very helpful that it's very important that it doesn't just come from me or my leadership team, that I'm involving and inviting people from the past year that are coming back. And I divided it into the three categories. So campers, schedule, and peer leadership, peer working. Oh, sorry. And the fourth one is safety, of course. We always do safety scenarios. I think it's best to do safety scenarios. But if we're taking safety scenarios out, it's really peer work, the camp schedule itself, and then also managing campers. And I utilize returning staff members to help develop it, which allows me then to also utilize them, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And when we're actually running the scenarios, we typically might do one or two scenarios in front of the entire group, but only with people that feel really confident and that we've
Mm.
prepared beforehand. But typically we start with very small groups. Nobody are paying attention except for the people in those scenarios. So it builds the confidence that it's typical and normal to do these scenarios. But if you have multiple staff members that were creating those scenarios with you, then I place them in those little groups to help guide that scenario work.
Absolutely. I think you can run scenarios on absolutely everything that you do at camp. I wouldn't, you understand? But you could. Can you imagine all you do all 10 days is scenarios? No, I wouldn't do that, but you could. So before planning for training, we always took a look at last summer. What were issues that turned into patterns? Camper behavior, bullying, fist fights breaking out between campers, how to
Mhm.
deal with picky eaters, you name it. And then every year those scenarios were different because we had different issues the summer before. And it was important to offer scenarios also with all the age groups that we saw at camp. So, for example, how you deal with bullying with 7-year-old boys and 15-year-old teenage young women can be a little bit different. So, you can put them into groups and give each group a different topic so that during the debrief, the whole room is learning from the smaller groups a whole lot of information. Or, allowing, of course, for questions and those in the other groups to add on to the advice. Or you can put them into smaller groups and give every group the exact same scenario to discuss and see where folks end up in the debrief. And be sure, I think, to correct any glaring errors in thinking before you move on. So, Gabs and I have chatted many times about the let me make this perfectly clear debriefs that so they can be a good time to share those kinds of policies that you may have at camp rather than just going on all these ideas of staff that may follow maybe some policies that you have are like black and white, and this is absolutely how we do it. We don't go any differently. There's no gray area in these certain things. So it's a good time to sort of share some of those if you've been coming across them in your scenarios. And the great thing about running scenarios and having discussions with staff who are then invested because they have their say is that you can learn from staff. They may come up with ideas you hadn't thought of before or ways to handle situations that could work better than how things are currently handled. So call them out, like thank them for their creativity and their brilliance and using those amazing ideas. We also ran a lot of skits. So we often used our, as Gab said, like more senior staff who prepared ahead of time and then performed. We then divided our staff into smaller groups and allowed them to discuss what they saw or how they would have handled that situation. And they really enjoyed the skits that were exactly the wrong way to handle situations. So it was a good way to release some tension, like have a laugh or two before they got down to the serious business of truly discussing how best to handle campers' behaviors and emergencies. I really suggest that you only choose your most experienced staff if you do amusing skits about how not to do things, because you want them to be funny and thought provoking, but you do not want things to get out of hand and the point to be missed. And I also wouldn't do them very often, like maybe once or twice, and that's it in your
Yeah.
training. But we also had success with running skit scenarios where certain staff members would volunteer to handle a camper situation or a staff issue, and then anyone else could shout pause, and the actors would freeze on the on the stage, and then the one who said pause would step in and continue and try their ideas, and then other staff could yell pause and so on. But getting staff involved, this is the practice that will build muscle memory and give them that confidence that they need to deal with all kinds of situations. Because even if you did an entire 10 days full of nothing but scenarios, you're still going to have stuff that comes up that you didn't talk about during those 10 days. Anything else on that before we move on to things we want to do for sure and things we want to avoid?
I mean, it's kind of an avoid, but I wanna
Okay.
piggyback off of your skit part because I think that is so essential to understand is we bring in all these staff who are natural entertainers, right? A lot
Hmm.
of our staff are,
Yep.
and I think just taking that second to make sure that folks know this is not a moment of entertainment, right? This is a
Right.
moment of learning,
Yes.
can be really successful, and then still we wanna be really careful what we ask when we're doing skits. I could remember a specific time in staff training being we were doing it on, like, policies and procedures, and we did a skit about sexual harassment, and I was the
Mm,
person receiving that, and I look back on that, I'm like,
Wow.
"That was not an appropriate place for a
Mm.
skit." And I think, again, some of those really high level, like, deeply emotional and personal should never be skitified.
yep.
Skitified. Um,
Just made up a word.
right? Like, we can problem solve through it, and we can use conversation techniques, but when anytime we put somebody up in front of a group to solve some of those, I think there's that natural inclination to entertain because that's part of why we love these people.
Yep.
So just being thoughtful about which ones we do.
Absolutely. I ran into that trouble myself one year when I allowed two staff members, senior staff members who'd been around a long time, to do the how to get fired session.
Yeah.
And they started with a skit. And I sat in the back going, big mistake, Beth, big mistake, and
Oh.
had to actually step in. So absolutely picking and choosing those types of skits if you're going to do them, um, but not anything serious or
Mhm.
emotionally threatening or anything like that for sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right. So what are some best practices for scenarios? Things that we should do for sure, things we should avoid. Chris, what else have you got besides being very careful, of course, with your content in skits?
Yeah. I think that giving folks a scenario response framework is really helpful. Gabs, you brought up lifeguarding, and I taught lifeguarding for a long time. And I think one thing that they do really well is the first, 3 steps of any response is the same, right? You survey the scene and you put on your protective stuff, and that becomes so part of the way you respond that it really starts you off on a positive note. So, thinking about how do we actually use that very good framework in response to other things. So, our first suggestion in any time anybody's responding to something is simply to slow down, right? Like that is the first part of scenarios is whatever is coming at you, taking that breath, taking that moment to recenter and say, okay, what is right in front of me? And getting folks to understand really the scenario as it starts is really just about what's in front of you and not we're going to need to change the policy down the road or we need to make sure we problem solve this from now until forevermore. What is the scenario saying that is right in front of me that I need to stabilize? Is there an immediate threat? Those kind of questions. So then when you're debriefing the scenarios, either in training or after something actually happens at camp, you can say, okay, how did you slow down? How did you look at what was in front of you? What did you perceive there? So it's giving folks kind of the same structure to respond, even if the way they respond is different. Another thing that I see pretty consistently across camps is people often don't know when to escalate a situation and when to deal with it themselves.
Mm,
So making sure that that's a really clear component of scenarios is okay, you dealt with what was in front of you. Did this need to be escalated to even your co-counselor? Did it need to be escalated beyond that to your village director or whoever, right? Whoever's in your hierarchy and making sure that people understand when does the next level get tapped in, and then in the training actually build in that as part of the activity. So when you escalate it, how does our
mhm.
leadership respond? Um, a lot of times when I watch scenarios, they're very much in the direct service. Oh, this happens to a counselor. What do they do? Which is good, but your program director needs to know what their responsibility is. So building that into the way scenarios are done, I think can be really, really important and good. And again, get folks in alignment about what is their actual part. Um, Something else that I think about is we often do scenarios in groups, which I think can be very positive, but there is a portion that we want our staff to be prepared that they know what to do, right? You're not going to ask your co-counselor what to do when a child is saying something to you directly and there's nobody else around. So helping staff understand that there's part of this that is individual, that you do need to be able to really step in and take charge of. And then, like I said, in that what is right in front of you stage, stabilize. And then you bring in other people. Then you look at the policy. Then you say, I like my bathroom example, right? The kid wanting to go to the bathroom. What was right in front of me was 2 kids who needed to go to the bathroom, and I needed to answer that question. And so I used safety, right? Can I see this person? Are they gonna be safe? Then I make a judgment call and go back and check the policy and see, okay, I got that one wrong. And I know in the future, but I'm not telling those kids I don't know what to do. So I think that's a really good way to think about it. Um, and the other piece that I think is really, really important is thinking about trigger warnings, right? Um, One of the reasons I love scenarios is I think it gives summer staff and people working at camp a clear understanding of the real hard things that could happen. And we're not going to get a trigger warning every time a kid is going to tell us something that's really, really hard, or every time an emergency happens. So making sure that there's like a protocol for when to use a trigger warning. And my recommendation would be the first time that you're talking about suicidal ideation and behavior, absolutely, you need to provide a trigger warning for that. And then make sure staff know in the future, because we have already supplied this trigger warning, we might hold that trigger warning through the end of camp. And if you have big feelings about that, let's talk about those individually. Um, and I don't know if that's the exact right way to do it, but I think it is really, really important that we are empowering staff to know hard things are going to happen, and you're not always going to get that warning. And we want to give you the best shot at building that confidence and that resilience to the things that might come up, that you can respond in a way that holds space for the person who is kind of coming to you with whatever it is.
I love that, Chris. Yeah, because everything these days comes with a trigger warning. So I love the idea that there are lots of things in life in person that don't. And how do we handle those? I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Gab, what about you?
Yes, I was going to say with the response framework, Chris, one of the ones that we use at Waro, is we just use SAS, which is stop what you're doing, approach appropriately, speak kindly. And that's our mission for any interaction you're having, anytime you're, dealing with an intervention. The tendency sometimes is to keep doing what you're doing and sort of shout across the room like, hey, put that down, or hey, use different language, but actually giving your full attention. So if people that are listening, if you want to use something to help, like these are the 3 steps we're looking for, is to stop what you're doing, approach appropriately, speak kindly. I think that can work out really nicely. For me, the much what you were saying, Chris, is sometimes, there's a dramatization of something that's not realistic, or much more of a downplay that's also not realistic. And part of scenario work is the acting piece, but it also shows that you understand how a 10-year-old, what they look like when they're missing home. And so as an example, some people will cry insanely, just a big sob, a huge crying. And it's like, this is not how a 10-year-old misses home. They sit quietly. They have the one tear that goes down their cheek. They're trying to participate, but they're not. So I think when I'm doing my work with my returning staff members, I'm asking them to do 3 things. 1, describe what it looks like realistically. So then that information is getting, shared with the quote unquote actors. What does success look like and sound like? So that when people are, actually doing the scenarios, we know when to sort of end the scenario, or we know when to say, pause, this is the direction we're looking for. And then, as you're mentioning, is always start small. So I like to do it in a non-intimidating way, where we might present 1 or 2 up on stage for the whole staff team to see, and we're showing those steps. I also like to present like the different roles. So for me, there's the lead. And so the lead is the person that's going into the scenario slightly unsure of what to expect. There's the actors, and then there's the observer. And everybody has a role. The lead is there to engage in the scenario. The actors are to participate in the scenario, but also after the scenario, they're there to provide a variation of what they appreciated and what they could do differently. And then thirdly, the observer is just a recap, basically what they saw and what they observed. And typically the person that's also the observer knows what success looks like and what it sounds like. So if they see a certain behavior or they hear it, they can say, pause, that was amazing, et cetera, et cetera. BTW, I use the same roles for when leading or teaching how to lead a game. We have the person that leads the game. The people that participate in the game, they always share a variation of the game afterwards, like different ideas. And then lastly, they have the observer that just shares like, the rules and the equipment, et cetera. So the lead, actors, and observer are the three different roles that I use for scenarios, and trying to start small with really easy stuff that everybody can be successful at the very beginning is really important in building confidence.
Thanks, Gab. For me, I think, I can't say this strongly enough, but it's the importance of debrief. And oftentimes scenarios can run long. People have been chatting. It's time for the next session. The bell rings. It's lunch. It's whatever. And debrief gets swept to the side because of time. And debriefs don't have to be long, but they do have to happen. You have to ask questions like, what did you see that was really smart? Or what did you hear that was really smart? What can you see worsen in this type of situation if it's not handled well? What can you do if you get into this type of situation and get stuck? So, debriefing is a crucial step in leadership training. And after each scenario, you want to avoid moving on too quickly without some form of reflection. And it gives staff that chance to process what happened, discuss what went well or not so well, and learn those key takeaways. Staff should understand, I think, that leadership isn't about perfection. So we want to avoid presenting scenarios that only showcase the ideal leaders without recognizing the value of vulnerability or mistakes or learning from failure. I mean, real world leaders make mistakes all the time, and the good ones adjust based on feedback. So make sure that they are left with this message before you move on to another session. The other thing I want to say, and I just hope nobody's still doing this, but I would avoid turning scenarios into games where someone is right and someone is wrong. So instead, what we want to be doing is emphasizing collaboration and personal growth. And as I said, learning from mistakes. So when I was a counselor, which I grant you was a long time ago, but I go to camps now and they're still doing stuff that happened in 1980. So I just want to put this out there. But we ran scenarios through a game called Thumbs Up, Thumbs Down. So you sat with a small group in a circle and you took turns answering a scenario, and they were like different for everybody in the small group. And after you answered, your group would then all at once either give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down or somewhere kind of in the middle. And then your group would discuss it. And I found this such at 16 an incredibly uncomfortable way to handle scenarios. They could make those who were new or inexperienced feel centered out and not in a good way. They were often embarrassed, and like, let's be honest, the thumb down symbol is a symbol of a loser or, bad idea, and it made people feel awful. And even if they were learning how to handle it better, it still made everybody feel awkward and awful. So please be sure not to put your staff in these kinds of positions when you're talking about scenarios. They're there to learn, and we want them to feel safe in asking questions and letting them know it's okay not to have all the answers by the end of the session or even by the end of training or by the end of the summer. And finally, we want to be sure that we really encourage diverse perspectives and collaboration. So we want to hear from folks and be sure that you set some ground rules with them about how they'd like to be heard or responded to and what would constitute a debate versus a disagreement, those kinds of things. These are usually great life skills that we're teaching in scenarios. And so we want to provide a great atmosphere of learning and the feeling of safety as best we can. So be sure to front load how you treat people at camp. And then, of course, be consistent with that. That's it from me. Anybody have anything else they want to say before Gab heads to recap?
I really appreciate what you shared about creating space for failure. I think that is actually probably one of the most key components to scenario training, is because, folks are going to walk in and they're not going to want to get it wrong. And I think as camp directors, as folks doing training, we have a little bit of front loading to do about how do you really invite people to fail and make sure they know that you actually mean it, right? I think especially earlier in the week, it's more important that you see how staff are problem solving than that they're problem solving it correctly, right? So again, they might not know exactly what to do, what your protocol is, but where do they base their decisions? And then making sure that maybe we have some folks who are on leadership, who have been at camp before, who are planted failures, right? Like we know they're going to give a bad response, and we're going to show how that we can compassionately correct that in a way that invites other people to take chances. I think that's a key component to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can give out I was just thinking in French, like gold is called or, and then or is like or. So we can give out the like gold star, like little gold stars. So every time you get the or award, meaning like you tried something and then you're like, or we could try this. It means that you actually pushed yourself, and it means that you went beyond maybe your comfort or your knowledge. And what we value at camp is that, especially during training, we want you to get these little gold star stickers because it means that you're not staying just in your safe zone. You're pushing yourself beyond, So I think that we can role model that or say that that's a goal. We're hoping everybody's is getting the OR award when we're doing our big scenario run through of like maybe the camp schedule or camper behavior management, et cetera, et cetera. We're hoping everybody's going to get the OR award. That's our goal.
Write that down for yourself, Gab.
Got it.
All right. And Gab, we'll move on to you for your recap.
Recap. Okay, everybody. As per usual, let's start with safety. Most importantly, trigger warnings. If we're talking about something that could be upsetting or could be obviously triggering, let's talk with that. But, really what we're looking at is we're looking at starting small. We're looking at, gently introducing different scenarios to staff members. And when we're talking about scenarios, there's 3 different ways that we can do that. You can do personal journaling scenarios, what if scenarios, and people can write it down. You can do group discussions, or what Chris, myself, and Beth were talking about a lot today was acting things out, improvisation. So when it comes to improvisation, what are some good do's and what are some good don'ts? Well, we have a lot of don'ts. For example, don't overact, don't underact. Make sure we're providing some nice descriptions on what we're looking for. We also want to make sure that we have a diverse perspective and that creating a safe space for failure is a priority. Letting staff members know that, hey, we're here to try because guess what? The real thing is happening in 7 days. And it's important that we get to try and talk about it. The other do is let's make a little bit of time to talk about it at the very end. The little discussion pieces are so key to help iron out some of the nuances that these scenarios, so fruitfully provide for all of us. Lastly, let's look at also what's everybody's role. Sometimes when we're doing acting out scenarios, the people that are the actual actors, they don't have anything to add, or then they should. So maybe they can give some variations on how they might approach a certain situation. Have somebody observe so that they can provide some feedback, and then let the lead actor know, hey, this is you're in the hot seat. We're all going to take turns, and we appreciate you that you're doing that as well. I also want to say thank you to Chris. He has come to our camp, and the scenario work that he brought to us was fantastic. Really, really appreciated it. So, scenario work, 75% retention over the 5% lecture retention. I think it's a win-win for all camps.
Thanks, Gab. Great recap as always. And as always, you can tell us your thoughts on this episode by using the hashtag camp code and let us know any topics you'd like us to discuss, any guests you recommend we have on the show, great leadership training tips that you have to share. We would love to hear from you. All right. So if they want to reach you, Chris, personally, where would they find you?
You can find me at chris@tcamp.org.
And can you spell TQAMP for folks, please?
I sure can. TQAMP.
Thank you. And Gabrielle, what about you?
They can find me where I work at waro.com, and they can message me at info@waro.com. Waro is all the vowels, OUAREAU.com.
Thank you. You can find out more about what I do at gocamp.pro or message me directly at beth@gocamp.pro. And our final segment on each podcast is always a best practice for leadership training. And this week's best practice comes from our special guest, Chris.
So, we talked a lot about selecting the right scenario. But I think one thing that is even beyond that is a best practice that I feel like camps should know is when you're thinking about using real life scenarios that happened at your camp, if it is something that was incredibly traumatic and it is still in the consciousness of the camp, that is not an okay scenario. Folks will be too close to it and they won't be able to problem solve outside of the emotions that they experienced when it happened. So think about other ways you can introduce kind of those big, hard scenarios that aren't based in a reality that actually happened to folks that they're still healing from.
I love that. Brilliant, brilliant. Well, Camp Code is part of the Go Camp Pro podcast network, and you can check out all our other podcasts at gocamp.pro/podcasts. So, thank you again for joining us on this journey as we work to give our campers, staff, families, and camps the best experience possible. And thank you so very much, Chris, for joining us, sharing your amazing wisdom, and for all you do for the industry. We're so very grateful to you. Thanks so much for listening, friends.